Greetings everybody, this is Marcus Toole and I'm in my home orchard and it is May 8th and we're here for an orchard tour as things stand right here on May 8th, 2020. And welcome to the video. This tree right here is a pear tree. It's actually got two varieties grafted into it. The main tree itself is Orient. And right here we have a graft of Acres Home that's grafted into the Orient tree. You can see the graft scar right here where the Acres Home is grafted into the Orient tree. Now, Acres Home is a very early blooming variety. The Orient is a moderately late blooming variety, and in my orchard this year the really early bloomers did not produce that much. If we look up in the tree, there are a few pears kind of in the top in the Acres Home part of the tree, but not nearly as many as there are in the Orient part of the tree. Now, both make very large pears. And I think the Orient pears are going to be much later ripening, and yet they are bigger than the Acres Home pears. And the Acres Home pear, up until this year, was the largest pear in terms of the size of the pears themselves in the orchard. So this is my first year getting the Orient, and they are going to be enormous pears. That's assuming the squirrels let the pears on this tree ripen. This tree has larger trees next to it, and so last year I started out with quite a few Acres Home pears on the tree and ended up not getting very many at all because of the squirrels. So I'm going to put bags of garlic in this tree pretty soon. That's assuming I can find the garlic powder. I don't think there's going to be any problem with finding garlic powder, but these days of COVID, you never know. Kind of right here next to the Acres Home tree are the endless summer hydrangeas. This is a kind of a purpley one, and it's a newer variety than the original endless home. My hydrangeas really struggled last year because of the drought. These are the only ones that really look decent this year. The ones in the front yard really, they're recovering, but they're not going to bloom much this year because they were really stressed from the drought last year. We've had a very wet spring so far, although it's looking like it's going to be a pretty dry May. Let's move along to another part of the orchard. This right here is one of the little plum trees in the orchard. This is actually a seedling. Now, I want to give a shout out to a YouTuber by the name of Dr. Whimsy Anderson. And she's a big advocate of all things green. And she has in the past encouraged her viewers to save seeds, even seeds of fruit, and to grow their own fruit. Well, I actually love the idea of saving seeds and planting them, and with vegetables, that's a very good idea. In fact, this year I planted black-eyed peas that I just out of the cupboard from the black-eyed peas that I bought from the grocery store for eating, and I got nearly 100% germination of them. I also planted black-eyed peas that I got the seeds from the seed store, and these are seeds that were being sold to farmers, and I got about 40% germination on them. So in that case, the seeds that came from the grocery store actually did better than the ones that had the pesticide treatment and all ready to go into a commercial planting, and those I got terrible germination, whereas the ones that just came out of the grocery store did fine. With fruit trees, it's a little different. The issue, most cultivar fruit trees, these are reproduced asexually, either through grafting a tree of known good fruit quality onto a tree of known good root qualities, and or the trees are simply rooted. That's another way, some species, that works better. With plums, they're typically grafted, and a lot of commercial plums are either grafted on a particular variety called Mariana, which has really good root qualities, although it does make good fruit too. And I have a Mariana tree that I grow for fruit, not as rootstock. Or they're grown onto the root of a peach seedling, and what the peach seedling does is that it dwarfs the plant and keeps the plum tree at a manageable size for a commercial producer. Because when plum is on its own roots, a lot of the cultivars make trees that are a little too big to manage in a commercial operation. This tree here actually is a seedling, and I have two seedlings that I have kept in the orchard just because I want to see what kind of fruit they make. When you plant a seedling of a fruit tree, it is actually a product of cross-pollination between the fruit-bearing variety and a pollinizer. It might be a wild plum, it might be another perfectly good cultivar, but what happens is that you don't know what the fruit qualities is going to be of a seedling. I kept two because actually I gave two. I have very little space for extra fruit trees in my yard, and while I germinate lots of plum seedlings that I use for rootstock, I kept two because the two that I kept had qualities of a Mariana plum. So the seed parent is one that's called Robusto. This is a Robusto plum that's grafted into a McKibben plum tree. This doesn't have it's only about a third of the tree, and these are the Robusto plums. They're very large plums. Now, I would be lying if I said that they were the best tasting plums there are. They actually, I mean, I think they're so-so in terms of flavor. Here is the Robusto part of the tree. I mean, sorry, the McKibben part of the tree. If you look at the Robusto plums, they're nearly twice the size of the McKibben plums. Now, the McKibben plums, that's an improved Chickasaw plum. The Robusto plum is a Chickasaw and Asian plum hybrid. And the McKibben plums are supposed to be pretty good plums, but they are also supposed to be true Chickasaw plums. This is a variety that originated in North Carolina. It was probably originally bred by North Americans, Native Americans, and then the settlers took them over. What we know about this plum tree is that the McKibben family took it from North Carolina to Mississippi in the aftermath of the Civil War, and it actually traveled to Mississippi by wagon train. And so it's a variety that has some history here. Robusto was bred by the USDA Agricultural Research Station in Byron, Georgia, and it was actually one of the first varieties they came up with. If you look at the Robusto, the leaves are kind of long. They kind of look like a Chickasaw plum. Now, if we go back to this seedling over here, what you'll notice about the leaves on it is that they're very coarsely ribbed. And that's a characteristic that I associate with the Mariana plum. Now let me go and show you a Mariana plum by comparison. We're in the part of the orchard where the Mariana plum is located. This big tree here is a Mariana plum, and it is standing next to a Robusto plum. This is the original Robusto plum in the orchard. Now this tree is a quarter the size of the Mariana tree. Now, I think Robusto just generally is going to make would make a smaller tree than Mariana no matter what. But this Robusto tree is as small as it is because it's on a peach rootstock. So this very much shows you what being on a peach rootstock does to a plum tree. Now, I think the Robusto left to its own devices would actually end up being the size of this Tools heirloom plum if it were on its own root. Now, these trees are all about 9 years old, so they're all about the same age, and so you see that Robusto is less than half the size of the Tools heirloom. It's a quarter of the size of the Mariana plum. Now, if you look close at the Mariana plum leaves, you'll notice that they're a little bit ribbed, and that's what I'm noticing in the leaves of the seedling plum, the 2 seedling plums that I've kept. Now, this tree last year had an enormous crop on it. This year the crop is actually smaller than it typically is. This year the crop is actually smaller than it typically is, and that's because it overcropped last year. And you know, it's actually a bad thing to let too many plums form on the tree. Actually, I may have let this Tools heirloom overcrop a little bit. However, the plums are not evenly dispersed on this tree, so only half the tree has a full crop of plums, and then the other half of the tree is pretty bare. It just bloomed that way, and I don't know why. I think part of the issue is there are some unhealthy limbs that are kind of in this space here. You see those new limbs coming up into that space, and I cut those unhealthy limbs out, and I think those unhealthy limbs last year kind of shade these bottom limbs, and because they were shaded, they didn't bear much. What will happen now is that this area will fill in, and then probably next year I'll prune out these bottom limbs, and these fresh limbs will replace them. I'm also going to do some thinning in the top, and that will also help greater light get to the bottom of the tree. My hope for the seedling, you know, we don't know what its fruit's going to be like. There's about a 1 in 30 chance that this seedling will be as good as one of its parents. However, if the pollen parent is Mariana, there's a chance that the seedling will produce fruit that is intermediate between Mariana and Robusto. And the Robusto fruit is a very large plum. But the flavor, you know, it's okay. It's good enough that you could, in fact, you probably have bought a Robusto in the supermarket at some point in your life. If you've ever bought a red plum, you might have. That's what color they are when they're ripe. Probably not. There are better commercial plums out there, but this is one of the commercial plums. Now, Mariana, you probably haven't bought them. The plums are a bit small to be sold in a grocery store as a commercial plum. But in my view, it's one of the best tasting plums out there. So if this plum could end up with some of the size of a Robusto, but some of the flavor of the Mariana, that would be a win-win situation. Have no idea if that's going to happen, and it really is probably a 1 in 30 chance that it would happen, assuming that Mariana is indeed the pollen parent of this tree. And we won't know until it produces fruit. And the thing is, it takes seedlings longer to produce fruit than it does for either a rooted cutting or for graft. So we may not know what the fruit for this tree is going to be like for 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years. However long it takes the tree to reach full sexual maturity, because when a seed germinates, that tree is brand new baby tissue, and it's a juvenile, and it will reach full size before it's sexually mature. Whereas when you graft onto a rootstock, the scion is coming from a mature tree. It's mature tissue, and usually you can cut down the number of years before the new tree reaches sexual maturity by 3 or 4 years in many cases, and often the tree will start bearing fruit. But sometimes the trees, when you have grafted cuttings, they'll actually try to bear fruit when the plant is way too small to support fruit, because the scion is mature, it's sexually mature, even though the tree is really, and particularly the rootstock, is just a baby. Now this is the McKibben Robusto plum tree combination that I was telling you about earlier. This is what the overall tree. I believe this tree is going to get much larger than it is. I expect it to get about the same size as the Tools Heirloom Plum. The Robusto tree that I have is so little. I'm really curious to know whether or not Robusto is how big it gets when it's on its own root. And so far the Robusto part of the tree is quite a bit shorter than the McKibben part. But it still seems to be keeping up. So the jury's still out as to how big the Robusto is going to get in comparison to the McKibben. One of the things I do notice is that the Robusto does, even though it is a Chickasaw Asian plum hybrid, it does not seem to be particularly cross-fertile with the improved Chickasaws. And that's one of the things I do want to check. I think it's mostly cross-fertile with the wild Chickasaw plums, but not necessarily with the commercial ones, with the cultivars. And I don't really have a good way of testing that anymore, but I know that there was several years where the Robusto and the Tools Heirloom were the only two mature plum trees in the yard, and they were not pollinizing each other, and I didn't get plums until I started bringing the flowers of wild plums into the yard, and then that pollinized both of the plum trees. Okay, let's continue on with our tour. Here we have the other seedling.
Remember I told you that I planted 2 seedling plums in the orchard. This is the other one, and I kept it in the orchard for the same reason that I kept the other one, and that is it has characteristics that are intermediate between Robusto and Mariana. I think it is potentially a cross between the two. The reason I think so is that if you look at the leaves, they are ribbed just like the last plum. The leaves are ribbed. That characteristic is called rugose from a plant taxonomy perspective. So I think it may well be a cross between the two. You know, this could also be, you know, they could both be crosses with the Chickasaw plum, a wild Chickasaw plum, in which case the fruit may not be all that special. It's even conceivable this plant looks a little bit like a hog plum, and if it's a cross with a hog plum, the fruit could end up being bitter. We just don't know until we get fruit, and there's just no telling when we will get fruit from this tree. Could be 2 years, unlikely. Could be 5 years, could be 10 years. Seedlings take longer, as I said. But anyway, let's move on through the orchard.
Now, in the same part of the yard where my McKibben plum is in, this is my front yard, I have something very exciting to show you, and this is the Guillemboyo persimmon tree. And you know, they can still fall off, but this is the first year where I have a fair number of persimmons on this tree. Guillemboyo is a very large astringent variety, and what that means is that the fruit is bitter and astringent, until it is completely and totally ripe. But once they are ripe, they become as sweet as honey. And this will be my first year having one of my astringent varieties to ripen fruit. So I'm used to eating the fruit of Fuyu, but I am very excited at the possibility of getting to try a Guillemboyo for the first time this year. That's really all I have to say about this tree right now. Also in the same part of the yard, I have an Asian pear. Uh, the main part of the tree of the Asian pear is a variety called Shinko, and in fact, the Shinko part isn't really doing that much this year. I grafted into one branch, and the plan was just to have one branch grafted into something else, and for most of the tree to be Shinko, and then for one branch just to have a little bit of 20th century in here. Well, as you can see, the 20th century part of the tree is doing way better than the Shinko part of the tree. The jury's very much out as to how well this is all going to do. Shinko is supposed to do well in this climate. This is my second time trying it. So just the fact that I'm saying it's my second time trying it tells you that the first attempt was not that stellar. So there you go. Another inhabitant of the front yard is my LeConte pear tree. The LeConte pear tree is the oldest of the high quality southern pear varieties. This is a hybrid between the Asian sand pear and the Bartlett pear, which is a European type that's nowhere near fire blight resistant enough for our climate. The history of the LeConte pear is that John LeConte, Captain John LeConte, who lived in Liberty County, Georgia, actually fought in the Mexican-American War. He was discharged from military service in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and while he was off at war, he had heard about the sand pear as being a variety of pear or a type of pear that could grow in the Deep South. The thing is, sand pears, true sand pears, don't have very good fruit quality. Well, he went to a nursery and bought a sand pear seedling and took it home, and when it produced pears, it made much better pears than you would expect from a sand pear. In fact, the pears were soft, they had the high fruit quality of a Bartlett pear, they even kind of looked like Bartlett pears, and indeed, over a century later, genetic analysis has shown that the Bartlett pear is the pollen parent to the LeConte pear. So this is an accidental hybrid, and it caused nursery people to realize that if you cross a sand pear with a European pear, you can sometimes get a pear variety that will take the low chilling hours and the fire blight pressure of the Deep South. So this is the very first high quality pear, and actually there was a pear growing industry in Georgia in the 1800s that continued until the 1920s, and it's all revolved around the LeConte. You can tell from the LeConte pear is actually full of fruit. Of all my pear trees, it has the fullest and most, to me, satisfying crop on it this year. Ordinarily, Golden Boy makes way bigger pears than LeConte pear, and ordinarily it's a little bit more productive, but this year it is absolutely the other way around. The LeConte pears are huge in comparison, and we're only in May 8th, so these pears are huge. You know, they're not as big as the Orient pear, but they're big. Now I want to show you something that's not good though. See that? That's cedar apple rust, and that's a bad thing.
That's a disease that is carried. Let's see. Let me find the camera. There you go. That disease is transmitted by a juniper tree, and there is a juniper tree across the yard over there. It's right there. I don't think you can. It's kind of that dark area, and that's the culprit right there. That's where that cedar apple rust came from. This is the first year I've had a problem with cedar apple rust. Oh well, it is what it is. Now, it's not bad so far. And so, the jury's still out as to whether or not I'm going to have a real problem with it. But one thing to know is pear is not known to be super susceptible to cedar apple rust, but we now know that LeConte can get it, at least some. So we shall see. Well, actually, I got something else to show you right over here. These are my some of my huckleberry bushes here. The huckleberry bushes made pretty good this year. They're about finished. I lost, I'd say, well over half the crop to a flock of catbirds that passed through the orchard. I guess they were heading north. I'm sure glad they didn't stay. Or else they would have wiped out everything in my orchard through the summer if that many catbirds stayed in my yard. I think they're just passing through and heading north. But they did a number on the huckleberries. Usually I have a very mean pair of mockingbirds in the yard that kind of help keep the birds off the huckleberries, the various flocking birds that pass through in early spring. But it's a different pair of mockingbirds this year, and they just are not as aggressive as the ones that we hear in previous years. They don't keep the other birds run off, and that's too bad, because I'd rather feed 2 mockingbirds with my berries than a million catbirds, and that's what happened this year with the huckleberries. I'll be lucky if I end up with a total of 3 gallons of them this year. Oh well, it is what it is. I have some in the freezer left over from last year, and with what I will produce this year, I'll have plenty. And also, this is going to be a good blackberry year, so I think what I lack in huckleberries, I will make up for in blackberries and maybe in blueberries as well. That was part 1 of the May 8th orchard tour. Part 2 will be posted shortly. Thank you.